Hello, listeners. Looking for more tales to entertain with esoteric delight and supernatural suspense? I would encourage you to check out Peculiar Stories. Join Indiana Beckett as she takes you on a walk around her particular side of the neighborhood in all things strange and unusual. You may find her on Anchor Podcasts or anywhere that your podcast can be found. 2020 has been a hell of a year, hasn't it? In front of me, I have numbers from the CDC. Projections about death. Of kidney disease, we shall lose 51,000 people. Diabetes shall claim 85,000. Alzheimer's, 122,000. 146,000 shall die of stroke. 160,000 shall die of chronic respiratory infections. Cancer will claim 606,000 people, and heart disease shall claim 655,000. These numbers are massive. But something to consider is that these are not sporadic or unexpected horrors. These, in most cases, 98% of them, are the result of long culminated medical complications. These are not bolts of lightning delivered from places unknown. Many of these have been brewing for at least a decade. So let's talk about the ones that are spur of the moment. They are just the product of 2020. 17,000 people will be claimed by traffic accidents. Murder will claim 19,000. 48,000 will commit suicide. Influenza will claim 59,000 people. Animal attacks, accidents in the home, and acts of God shall claim 167,000 people. Mind you, these are just numbers in America alone. The number one killer will be COVID, with its current count of 267,000 lives. When you look at the raw numbers, you compare them to things like heart disease at 655,000 or cancer at 606,000. 267,000 seems drastically less, but a point of consideration is that this isn't a preambled event. This isn't something that you've had years to prepare for. This is, I've got a sniffle, a cough, a tickle in my throat. I can't smell food. I can't taste anything. Suddenly you're drowning in your own lungs, and you're dying, and you're gone. And the survivors are left to wallow in the memory. This is something unprecedented and terrifying, worse than anything else we've experienced thus far in America. Please, wear a mask. Practice safe distancing. Wash your hands. Be the change you want. If you don't want to live in a world where you cannot see your friends and loved ones, wear a mask. We don't gather today, that we may gather tomorrow, and no one will be missing. These are dark times, and these stories come from very dark places. Hello, listeners. This is Jonas Armitage, and you're listening to Stories from Dark Places. On tonight's show, we shall be listening to The Boarded Window by Ambrose Bierce, a prolific author responsible for some of the greatest short stories of his time. Other than that, I'd like to wish you all a belated happy Thanksgiving. I hope you all enjoyed your feasts in the company of your immediate families. And I hope sincerely that you visited your others virtually. The telephone, or FaceTime if you're an Apple user, or making utilization of video chat programs like Discord, Skype, or Zoom, or the others out there. It is a strange year, 2020, and we've spent so much time separated from those we love. Many of us are not accustomed to having so much time to ourselves. But it is important to remember that we do not gather today, so that we may gather tomorrow and none shall be missing. In these times of COVID, the risk of contamination is significant, and we are seeing deaths across all spectrums of age and long-term medical complications for the most unexpected of us all. So while it is difficult, I hope you are being safe and that you make your actions not at the behest of your government, your advisors, your employers, or your state legislature, but you make these choices for those you love, for their safety. Remember, wearing a mask does not protect you, it protects those around you. And if we all do it, we can all go back to the way we like things better, sooner. We shall have our story in a moment's time when we return from this message from our sponsors.
Soul crystals not pure enough? Spirit ring journals too smeared? Holy water looking murky? Then come to Verboten Knickknacks and Collectables, home of the largest collection of arcane artifacts, cursed objects, and unearthly articles since the Pines Cryptid Museum disappeared with the rest of Ashley, Kansas. Hi, this is Kai the Intern. I wanted to tell you that Verboten Knickknacks and Collectables has everything you could ever want. Whether you're a disciple of the Mad Arab himself, or a curious teenager looking to summon your first shoggoth. I just bought a new corpse candle last week and it still looks new. You'd never know I'd summoned the dead twice this week already. Verboten Knickknacks and Collectables, where the only thing you can't find is a bloated price tag.
In 1830, only a few miles away from what is now the great city of Cincinnati, lay an immense and almost unbroken forest. The whole region was sparsely settled by people of the frontier, restless souls who no sooner had hewn fairly habitable homes out of the wilderness and attained to that degree of prosperity which today we should call indigence, than, impelled by some mysterious impulse of their nature, they abandoned all and pushed farther westward, to encounter new peril and privations in the effort to regain the meager comforts which they had voluntarily renounced. Many of them had already forsaken that region for the remoter settlements, but among those remaining was one who had been on those first arriving. He lived alone in a house of logs surrounded on all sides by the great forest, of whose gloom and silence he seemed a part, for no one had ever known him to smile or speak a needless word. His simple wants were supplied by the sale or barter of skins of wild animals in the river town, for not a thing did he grow upon the land which, if needful, he might have claimed by right of undisturbed possession. There were evidences of improvement. A few acres of ground immediately about the house had once been cleared of its trees, the decayed stumps of which were half concealed by the new growth that had been suffered to repair the ravaged rot by the axe. Apparently, the man's zeal for agriculture had burned with a failing flame, expiring in penitential ashes. The little log house, with its chimney of sticks, its roof of warping clapboards weighted with traversing poles, and its chinking of clay, had a single door, and directly opposite, a window. The latter, however, was boarded up. Nobody could remember a time when it was not, and none knew why it was so closed. Certainly not because of the occupant's dislike of light and air, for on those rare occasions when a hunter had passed that lonely spot, the recluse had commonly been seen sunning himself on his doorstep, if heaven had provided sunshine for his need. I fancy there are few persons living today who ever knew the secret of that window, but I am one, as you shall see. The man's name was said to be Murlock. He was apparently 70 years old, actually about 50. Something besides years had had a hand in his aging. His hair and long full beard were white, his gray, lusterless eyes sunken. His face singularly seamed with wrinkles which appeared to belong to two intersecting systems. In figure he was tall and spare, with a stoop of the shoulders, a burden-bearer. I never saw him, These particulars I learned from my grandfather, for whom also I got the man's story when I was a lad. He had known him when living nearby in that earlier day. One day, Murlock was found in his cabin dead. It was not a time and place of coroners and newspapers, and I suppose it was agreed that he had died from natural causes, or I should have been told, and should remember. I know only that with what was probably a sense of the fitness of things, the body was buried near the cabin, alongside the grave of his wife, who had preceded him by so many years that local tradition had retained hardly a hint of her existence. That closes the final chapter of this true story, excepting, indeed, the circumstances that many years after, in company with an equally intrepid spirit, I penetrated to the place, and ventured near enough to the ruined cabin to throw a stone against it, and ran away to avoid the ghost which every well-informed boy whereabout knew haunted the spot. But there is an earlier chapter that's supplied by my grandfather. When Murlock built his cabin and began laying sturdily about with his axe to hew out a farm, the rifle, meanwhile, his means of support, he was young, strong, and full of hope. In that eastern country whence he came, he had married, and was the fashion, a young woman in all ways worthy of his honest devotion, who shared the dangers and privations of his lot with a willing spirit and light heart. There is no known record of her name. Of her charms of mind and person tradition is silent, and the doubter is at liberty to entertain his doubt. But God forbid that I should share it. Of their affection and happiness there is abundant assurance in every added day of the man's widowed life. For what but the magnetism of a blessed memory could have chained that venturesome spirit to a lot like that? One day, Murlock returned from gunning in a distant part of the forest to find his wife prostrate with fever and delirious. There was no physician within miles, no neighbor, nor was she in a condition to be left to summon help. So he set about the task of nursing her back to health. But at the end of the third day, she fell into unconsciousness ere it so passed away, apparently with never a gleam of returning reason. For what we know of a nature like his, we may venture to sketch in some of the details to the outline picture drawn by my grandfather. When convinced that she was dead, Murlock had sense enough to remember that the dead must be prepared for burial. In performance of this sacred duty, he blundered now and again, did certain things incorrectly, and others, which he did correctly, were done over and over. His occasional failures to accomplish some simple and ordinary act filled him with astonishment, like that of a drunken man who wonders at the suspension of familiar natural laws. He was surprised, too, that he did not weep, surprised and a little ashamed. Surely it is unkind not to weep for the dead. "Tomorrow," he said aloud, "I shall have to make a coffin and dig the grave, and then I shall miss her when she is no longer in sight. But now she is dead, of course. But it's all right. It must be all right somehow. Things cannot be so bad as they seem." He stood over the body in the fading light, adjusting the hair and putting the finishing touches to the simple toilet, doing all mechanically with soulless care. And still through his consciousness ran an undersense of conviction that all was right, that he should have her again as before, and everything explained. He had had no experience in grief. His capacity had not been enlarged by use. His heart could not contain it all, nor his imagination rightly conceive it. He did not know he was so hard struck. That knowledge would come later and never go. Grief is an artist of powers as various as the instruments upon which he plays his dirges for the dead, evoking from some the sharpest, shrillest notes, from others the low, grave chords that throb recurrent, like the slow beating of a distant drum. Some natures it startles, some it stupefies. To one it comes like the stroke of an arrow, stinging all the sensibilities to a keener life. To another as the blow of a bludgeon, which in crushing benumbs. We may conceive Murlock to have been that way affected, for, and here we are upon surer ground, that of conjecture, no sooner had he finished his pious work than, sinking into a chair by the side of the table upon which the body lay, and noting how white the profile showed in the deepening gloom, he laid his arms upon the table's edge and dropped his face to them, tearless yet and unutterably weary. At that moment, came in through the window a long, wailing sound like the cry of a lost child in the far deeps of the darkening woods. But the man did not move. Again, and nearer than before, sounded that unearthly cry upon his failing sense. Perhaps it was a wild beast, perhaps it was a dream, for Murloc was asleep. Some hours later, as it afterward appeared, this unfaithful watcher awoke, and lifting his head from his arms, intently listened and knew not why. There, in the black darkness by the side of the dead, recalling all without a shock, he strained his eyes to see, he knew not what. His senses were alert, his breath was suspended, his blood stilled its tides as if to assist the silence. Who, what had waked him, and where was it? Suddenly the table shook beneath his arms, and at the same moment he heard, or fancied he heard, a light, soft step. Another sound as of bare feet upon the floor. He was terrified beyond the power to cry out or move. Perforce he waited there in the dark through seeming centuries of such dread as one may know yet live to tell. He tried vainly to speak the dead woman's name, vainly to stretch forth his hand across the table to learn if she was there. His throat was powerless, his arms and hands like lead. Then occurred something most frightful. Some heavy body seemed hurled against the table with an impetus that pushed it against his breast so sharp as nearly to overthrow him. And at the same instant he heard and felt the fall of something upon the floor with so violent a thump that the whole house was shaken by the impact. A scuffling ensued, and a confusion of sounds impossible to describe. Murloc had risen to his feet. Fear had by excess forfeited control of his faculties. He flung his hands upon the table, and nothing was there. There is a point at which terror may turn to madness, and madness insight to action. With no definite intent, from no motive but the wayward impulse of a madman, Murloc sprang to the wall with a little groping and seized his loaded rifle, and without aim discharged it. By the flash which lit up the room with vivid illumination, he saw an enormous panther dragging the dead woman towards the window, its teeth fixed in her throat. Then there were darkness blacker than before, and silence, and when he returned to consciousness, the sun was high, the wood vocal with the song of birds. The body lay near the window, where the beast had left it when frightened by the flash and report of the rifle. The clothing was deranged, the long hair in disorder. The limbs lay anyhow. From the throat, dreadfully lacerated, had issued a pool of blood not yet entirely coagulated. The ribbon with which he had bound the wrists was broken. The hands were tightly clenched. Between the teeth was a fragment of the animal's ear. A gruesome tale, to be sure. It is said that the idea of a premature burial, or being buried alive, is one of the most common phobias today. The idea that you could be trapped and entombed, left slowly to die from asphyxiation, dehydration, starvation, or hypothermia is terrifying. Could you imagine trapped in a box? A space like a sleeping bag, but firm, unable to move, to escape yourself. More terrifying, I think, is the idea that this method was used as a decided method of execution for women who violated the oath of celibacy when they had been decided to be vestal virgins. The idea is terrible. Thankfully, medical science has evolved to a point where that's no longer a concern. Now, if you're buried alive, it's because somebody desperately hates you. So let's all take that forward as advice to be kind to each other. Avoid these things in days to come. But that's all the time we have tonight. I would like to thank our subscribers, our followers on Twitter, YouTube, and Anchor, and every other place our podcast can be found. We do this for you because we love to share our stories, and the fact that you're out there listening with bated breath to hear my words fills me with a sense of delight. Good night, listeners. And please remember those nights when you wake up and it's dark You hear a shuffle, a murmur, a step, ghostly, in the still dark. There's nothing to be afraid of. After all, some of the best things only happen in the dark.
Stories from Dark Places was recorded before an imaginary studio audience. All stories performed on this podcast have express written consent from the original author. Jonas Armitage, his studio manager, and the entire staff of WZHP Radio Innsmouth are fictitious characters, and it's probably for the best that you continue to believe that.